Well, welcome to Christ and Culture. This is Pastor Jeff Short, your Bible teacher and cultural analyst. And today we're going to be covering an article that appeared in Christianity Today magazine. A few weeks ago, it was in response to the President Donald Trump's decision to bomb an Iranian nuclear facility that was producing weapons-grade uranium that might get into the hands of a terrorist organization and used against the United States or Israel or one of the friendly countries of the world. So he decided that since the United States was the only country that had a bomb that could penetrate down, I think, 200, 300 feet below the surface and take out a hidden facility, that we should use it to stop Iran from developing nuclear weapons of mass destruction. So he did. And here's an article in Christianity Today that is critical of that decision and says that it was immoral and illegal and all kinds of reasons why that shouldn't have been done from a Christian perspective. Now, on this kind of an issue, there can be disagreements among Christians. There can be Christians sitting in the pew next to you who say that, yes, it was justified in attempting to take out a nuclear weapons facility to save the world from a terrorist nuclear attack. It was justified. There are other Christians who would say, no, it wasn't, because we were not directly attacked by an act of war coming from Iran, and so we shouldn't have done it. We should let Israel fight their own wars, and we should let them do the dirty work of bombing nuclear facilities if that's what they think they should do in order to protect their nation. But we shouldn't have been involved. So Christians can differ on whether we should have or shouldn't have taken out a nuclear facility in Iran that might be used for terrorist nuclear attack. What I argued before a couple of weeks ago was that it is not a genuine Christian position to say that Christians should not ever, in any sense, use weapons or violence to stop terrorism. That is what Stanley Hauerwas tried to argue. He said this was a terrible atrocity that we committed against the people of Iran. And as Christians, we should never involve ourselves in war, and we should never involve ourselves in violent use of a means to stop even evil. We should never use violence to do that, because Jesus taught turn the other cheek, and he taught nonviolence. And I showed in that article that Jesus is taken entirely out of context. Jesus is not talking to nations. He's not addressing the issue of whether a nation should be able to defend itself or not. He's talking to individuals. He's telling us that we should be people of peace, that we should not be walking around with a chip on our shoulder, ready to give someone what they gave us, and walking around and looking for trouble, or being too quick and swift to fight and do violence against other people. We should be peaceful people and be led by the Holy Spirit and avoid conflict as much as possible. And I think that that's what most Christians do. And I think that Christians are being taught by Christ to be peacemakers instead of violent people. But Jesus was not talking to or addressing world leaders. He was not talking to the police force that has to be present in any society for there to be law and order. He's not saying that in a Christian society we should totally dismantle and defund the police because they use violent force sometimes to arrest the bad guy or to punish the bad guy. He's not addressing military leaders. He's not addressing presidents, prime ministers, sovereign nations. He's not addressing those larger contexts. He's addressing the smaller contexts where Christians have to deal with everyday problems, more or less, like people offending us, people even being aggressive toward us. We have to think first in terms of peace and not to tit for tat, like in the Middle East, where there's a lot of that tit for tat. And we should be people of peace. And so we cannot use the words of Jesus to turn the other cheek as a prelude to doing nothing against, say, Hitler's Nazis when they invade Europe, and we have to sit back and let it all happen because we're Christians and we can't involve ourselves in violence, even for a good cause. No, that's not true. So today, we're talking entirely differently. We're talking about another Christian who is arguing that we shouldn't have been involved in a airstrike. I believe this Christian also, her name is Bonnie Christian, wrote this article, A War of Choice, the Wrong Choice. She actually does believe that war is necessary in certain circumstances. So she does, I believe she subscribes to a just war theory, some kind of just rationale for war. So we'll read further, but I think that's the case. Well, let's get into the article. A case that the recent airstrikes of Iran are unlawful, unnecessary, unpopular, and risky, especially for persecuted Iranian Christians. So she's worried about Christians in Iran. Christians in Iran, no question, have a rough go of it because they're in a predominantly Muslim country. So their lives are really tough. Should that be a factor in nations of the world deciding whether to strike or not to strike nuclear facilities in Iran? I'm not sure how much weight that should hold. I'm sure you could always find reasons why you shouldn't strike nuclear facilities in a terrorist nation. But I think the logic is simply unassailable, and that is that if Iran is the leading exporter of terrorism, and they are, and Iran gets nuclear bombs and weapons, and they would eventually, if they're not stopped, then it stands to reason that Iran would export nuclear weapons via terrorist groups of different varieties that they fund, and that eventually these terrorists would explode a nuclear weapon in a large city, and then a lot of Christians would die, and a lot of non-Christians would die, and a lot of people, period, would die. So millions and millions of people would die. So this is not something that you play around with. So let's get into the article and find out what her reasons are, why she doesn't think that the U.S. should help Israel take out these facilities like we did. President Trump's decision to join the Israeli attack on Iran was a long time coming. Tehran would get nuclear weapons very soon if we didn't take action, U.S. and Israeli officials warned in the New York Times in 1995. Well, that was probably true in 1995. So I think she's quoting this to say, see, they've been warning about nuclear weapons all long time. Yeah, because I think the nuclear threat has been there for a long time. George W. Bush tasked the Pentagon with studying strike options to stop the bomb clock, at least temporarily, and on the campaign trail in 2008, John McCain jokingly saying, bomb, 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 Iran. Israel said a bomb was imminent during the Obama administration, perhaps less than 3 years away. Per country's defense minister in 2011, and the Biden administration reportedly prepared plans to bomb Iranian nuclear sites earlier this year. Yes, because the stakes are so high, because if this exporter of terrorist groups and terrorist weapons got a nuclear weapon, that would change the entire world scene. It would put every country at risk, and it would therefore create a weapon of mass destruction that could be used not only in the Middle East, but it could be used against Europe. It could be used against the United States. It would make a dangerous situation for everyone in the whole world because these bombs could be moved. That long run-up may lend U.S. participation in this war in air inevitably. In my view, it shouldn't. Okay, so she's going to say why we shouldn't take that threat seriously. This is a war of choice. It is a wrong choice. Okay, why? Why is it a wrong choice? These U.S. strikes on Iran are unlawful, unnecessary, and unlawful. Is there a law that says that because Iran is about ready to develop a nuclear grade uranium and produce a weapon that we can't take that out? There's a law somewhere against that? Unnecessary, unpopular, risky, dubious strategic value. So she's making a lot of claims here. Let's see if she can back any of them up. They may or may not succeed in temporarily stopping the bomb clock. So shouldn't we try it at least, though? What's wrong with trying? At least we're doing something. We're not just letting them get the bomb and then go, oh, that's terrible. They have the nuclear weapon now they can give to terrorist groups anywhere around the world, and they can blow up cities anywhere around the world. Shouldn't we try? But they are a strategic gamble. Yes, it is. For those of us eager for the freedom and safety of Christians and other oppressed people in Iran, this is a moment to pray for wisdom and peace. Yes, we're concerned about the Christians in Iran. How many are there? Let's just say there aren't that many, a few thousand, but they're important people. But so are the lives of 1 million, 10 million Christians or more that a nuclear bomb might destroy and kill. So if you're worried just about Christians and oppressed people in Iran, then are you worried about the tens of millions that might die and suffer through terrorist nuclear strikes? Are you worried about that? I don't see the concern here. Vice President J.D. Vance, likely aware that a majority of Americans' public, including majority of Republicans, oppose U.S. war with Iran, insists that the Trump administration does not want to escalate this conflict to boots on the ground. Indeed, he insists that U.S. isn't at all a war against Iran. And that's true. She's assuming that because we do this, that all of a sudden there isn't a war against Iran. There have always been, over the last decades or so, a war against terrorism. And Iran has been the number one exporter of terrorists. That's a fact. And terrorism and funding it. So, in a sense, we've always been at war with Iran because they've been at war with us through terrorism. And so we've always had our eye on Iran like we have not other countries. So why is that so shocking that we would try to move to prevent them from getting the ultimate terrorist weapon, right? Nuclear weapons? Imagine a whole city like New York blown up, wiped off the face of the earth. Imagine the whole country of Israel, Jerusalem, a bomb dropped, and the whole nation of Israel, 9 million people. There's only 9 million people in Israel. Entirely gone, a big crater. That is our concern. What about the Christians in Israel? What about the Christians in all of the other countries around the Middle East that potentially will die? Yeah, we do this because we don't want a war with Iran. We don't want to have to fight bullet for bullet. We want to stop them from developing this massive weapon of destruction so that they don't use it, so the world is a better place. That letter claim is laughable. If Iran bombed Fort Bragg, we would accept the claim that they weren't at war with us. It also points us toward the legal problems, which is that the U.S. Constitution assigns the power to declare war to Congress, not President, and the Congress does not declare this war. Well, the reality is that even though the Constitution assigns the power to Congress to declare war, as she probably knows, we've had to do a number of wars that Congress didn't declare. The Vietnam War, the Gulf War, and all kinds of wars we've had to fight where there wasn't an official vote in Congress. But that did not stop the necessity of acting. And it's within the president's purview to be able to send the military in and do certain military actions. This was not a declaration of war by President Trump against the nation of Iran. It's the administration's attempt to stop a nuclear holocaust. Notes on the Constitution Convention from James Madison, which include comments from father of the Bill of Rights, George Mason, make the intent here inescapably clear. The framers of our Constitution thought no single man was safely to be trusted with this enormous power. They were interested in clogging rather than facilitating war instead of facilitating peace. Facilitating peace, permitting the president to act alone only to repel sudden attacks. We're not under sudden attack. Well, the situation with a nuclear-capable Iran is a danger, is a grave and imminent danger. Definitely within the scope of a president to do. If the Iranians, and the reports were that the Iranians were within, months of getting weapons-grade uranium. It takes a process to get uranium up to the point of a nuclear weapon, and they were within months of that. That's the intel. So would you rather the United States say, oh, well, they've been saying that for so many years and even decades? Yes, and there have been successful attempts to set their programs back different times. Remember the sabotage that took place a number of years ago where there was a virus planted in some software in a centrifuge facility that basically destroyed the centrifuges? Remember that? That was an attempt, and a successful one, I believe, to set back the Iranian nuclear weapons program. And it worked. I believe it worked. I think the intel bears that out. So any attempt to oppose Iran getting nuclear weapons is a good thing. So instead of quibbling about, well, it doesn't say in the Constitution that the president should be able to do something like this, well, that's questionable. There are arguments that can be made that it does give him that power. Especially because it didn't involve sending troops into Iran and taking out this, that, and the other. It involved dropping a bomb on a very precise target, and that was a nuclear facility where they're making these bombs. I believe this attack also violates the War Powers Act of 1973, which was passed over the veto of Richard Nixon in an effort to constrain lawless presidential war making. So you believe taking out a nuclear facility in a terrorist sponsoring state so that they don't get weapons of mass destruction to use against anyone at any time is an act of lawlessness by the president and war making? Wow. I don't know. I don't see how you can justify that belief. The War Powers Act has 3 scenarios under which the president can initiate military action: declaration of war, specific statutory authorization, and national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories, possessions, its armed forces. None of these conditions are applicable here. So she's going to be a lawyer, and she's going to argue we shouldn't stop Iran from building a nuclear bomb. Or she's going to make it so impossible to meet the conditions to take out their facility that we never actually get around to doing it. And she's going to be the one that would go, oh, that's terrible. They have a nuclear weapon now. Even if these strikes were necessary, the president, like many presidents before him, Democrat and Republican alike, who deemed themselves trustworthy with power that was never theirs, is breaking his oath to the Constitution. Okay. As the prophet Hezekiah warns of abuse of power, therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. Okay, that quote and that verse is such a lame attempt to throw in some kind of theology here. Really? You're going to quote a verse in the Old Testament to show that President Donald Trump doesn't have the right, the moral right, to stop nuclear weapon developments from a terrorist state? Really? But my contention is that the strikes weren't necessary. So even though it's totally illegal and they weren't even necessary, a clip of a conversation between pundit Tucker Carlson, Republican Senator Ted Cruz, circulated online in recent days because Cruz, who supports forcible regime change in Iran, couldn't say how many people live there. So here's a more important number. Iran's gross domestic product, $341 billion as of 2025, is less than half the U.S. defense spending, $850 billion in 2024. So how does that connect with the possibility of having a nuclear Iran? That is, the money we spend on our military every year is more than twice as much as the Iranian economy. That's not Iran's entire government budget. It's all of Iran's economy, the whole thing. Okay. And the point being, this isn't to say Iran can't do anything to harm the U.S. interests, and especially U.S. forces stationed around the Middle East. But Iran cannot pose anything like an existential threat to America, not even if its nuclear program were much further along than it was before these strikes. Oh, really? They can't smuggle a nuclear weapon once they get to the uranium to the certain level into the United States. They could never do that. You know for a fact they can't do that. This is crazy. This is wishful thinking, fantasy land. This is a poor, weak country half of a world away, separated from the U.S. by an ocean and surrounded by hostile powers, and there's no scenario in which Iran somehow conquers the United States. It's not a matter of conquering the U.S. It's a matter of blowing up a city, a terrorist attack. You know, the 9/11 terrorists, they didn't conquer the U.S. They just basically blew up 2 huge buildings and killed thousands of lives. Well, a nuclear bomb would do a lot more than that. You don't have to conquer the United States to cripple it, to destroy millions of lives. So any attempt to stop that destruction of millions of lives in the U.S. or Europe or anywhere is a good and noble thing. Yet there is a scenario in which the U.S. loses this war in the style of the last 2 decades' losses in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, and Libya. There's a more than plausible scenario in which this is the beginning of another years-long quagmire that destabilizes society and leaves tens of hundreds of thousands of innocent dead with little or nothing to show for it. We should know by now that the U.S. orchestrated regime change does not reliably lead to liberty and peace. Well, that's true. I don't dispute that, but you're not getting at the core of the argument. The argument is we don't want a terrorist state to get a nuclear weapon. That's bad for everyone in the world. And it's bad for millions, potential millions and tens of millions of loss of life. I think in particular the danger war brings to Christians in Iran. Okay. Already a persecuted minority subjected to imprisonment, raids, fines, beatings, and other cruelties for their faith, Iranian Christians will be even more vulnerable if this war is prolonged. It's not like bombs will bypass all the Christian houses. Moreover, tyrannical regimes under pressure often grow more tyrannical, especially toward the dissidents and ideological minorities like Christians under an autocratic Islamic state. Yes, I agree that it could be bad news for Christians, but you still have to think about the millions and tens of millions of Christians that would die if there's a nuclear terrorist strike. And while we may hope that the conflict could bring to power a new, more lenient government in Tehran, there's no guarantee that the outcome quite the opposite. The number of Christians in Iraq shrank by more than 80% due to the U.S.-initiated war and its aftermath. I don't think we're not sending troops in there to change the regime. That's not the agenda right now. It's to stop a nuclear weapons program. That's it. Very simple. A surgical strike, boom, destroys the facility. That, I think, is what Trump was saying was going to be the end of it. Iraq was estimated to have 1.5 million Christians before the 2003 U.S.-led invasion. Associated reported those ancient churches had roots stretching all the way back to the early church, but today church officials estimate only a few 100,000 Christians or even less remain within Iraq's borders, many of them feeling abandoned, bitter, and helpless, less free to worship than they were under the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. We all want freedom from Iranian Christians, but it is naive to imagine that an American war is a surefire way to get it. Well, I don't believe that war with Iraq is the goal. And I don't think that anybody thinks that we will see a war with Iran because of what we did. I think the hope is that that will be the end of it. And until they start getting more developed in their nuclear weapons program, and then we'll have to do that again unless they want the way of peace. Looking ahead, I hope Vance's yes is yes in his promise about escalation. I want to trust that he's telling the truth. I pray for Trump and Vance and all those in authorities that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness in Israel and U.S. and Iran alike. And still, I admit I'm skeptical of the prudence of our leaders and worried about where we go from here. With the writer of Ecclesiastes, I suspect that what has been will always be again, and what has been done will be done again. The quiet words of the wise are more to be heeded than the shouts of the ruler of fools, he says. But all I hear is shouting. Wisdom is better than weapons of war. But we have fallen people are better at building weapons than we are at being wise. Not necessarily. I think this was a wise decision for Trump to bomb a nuclear facility. And it may not even go any further than that. But you have to be willing to risk something to stop this terrorist state from gaining nuclear power. I think this writer, she's willing to basically let Iran get a nuclear weapon and hope for the best. I think that's crazy. Someday God himself will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many people. Yes, God will always be the judge. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not take up sword against nation, nor will he train for war anymore. Isaiah 2:4. But that day doesn't seem to be coming this week. Right, because that day will come when Christ returns. So if you're waiting for that to happen, you are not realistic. So I think her argument was totally unconvincing, and I think her assumptions are wrong. One, we're not at war, per se, with Iran, other than the war against terrorism. And this limited strike, it's over now. We're not doing that anymore. We're not bombing Iran, and we're not sending soldiers in there. We're not doing all kinds of things that would be acts of war. It's over. It's done, hopefully for good. Hopefully this set them back. Hopefully we won't have to deal with that anymore. Hope this has been a helpful commentary. We'll see you back next week. God bless.